The first thing most people noticed about Norah Callahan was her hair. It was the kind of red that stopped conversations, the kind that caught the afternoon light and held it, the color of fresh embers just before they go white, and it fell down her back in a thick braid that was always coming undone because she was always moving, always doing something with her hands, and had no patience for things that needed constant tending. The second thing people noticed, usually shortly after the first, was that she was standing at an anvil with a hammer in her hand and a look on her face that suggested she had neither the time nor the interest in whatever opinion they were forming about the first thing. Norah Callahan had been running her father's smithy on the edge of Redbud, Texas for 2 years, since the autumn Patrick Callahan's heart had given out between one breath and the next while he was banking the forge for the evening, and she had found him there in the morning when she came to open up, already gone, his big hands folded in his lap as if he had simply sat down to rest. She had buried him on a Tuesday and opened the smithy again on Thursday because the work did not stop needing doing, simply because the person who did it was grieving, and because the alternative was to close the doors and sell the tools and go live with her aunt in San Antonio. And Norah Callahan would have shod horses with her bare hands before she did that. The town had opinions. Redbud was a small town, and small towns have opinions about everything, and about women doing unexpected things most of all. And the opinions about Norah ranged from grudging respect from the ranchers who needed their horses, shod and their tools repaired, and found that she did both as well as her father had, to a persistent low-level disapproval from certain quarters that she was doing something unseemly, something that did not fit the shape of what a young woman of 26 ought to be doing with herself. Norah's response to these opinions was to get up before dawn every morning and fire the forge and do the work, which she found more satisfying than any conversation on the subject could have been. Jack Puit came to Redbud on a Wednesday in late September with a bay mare that needed 2 new shoes and a loose buckle on her bridle that had been annoying him for 3 days. And he had been directed to the smithy on the edge of town by the man at the livery who told him the Callahan girl did good work and not to let the hair put him off his stride. Jack was not entirely sure what that meant until he came through the gate of the smithy yard and saw her. She was at the anvil, her back to him, her braid half undone and several shades darker at the ends from the heat, her leather apron over a plain blue dress, and she was working a piece of iron with a rhythm and a focus that made the yard feel quiet around her, despite the noise of the hammer, and the afternoon light was coming in low from the west and catching the loose strands of her hair and turning them the color of something he did not immediately have a word for. He stood there longer than he should have before he remembered why he had come. He said, "Excuse me," and she did not look up immediately, finished the stroke she was on, set the iron aside, and then turned and looked at him with green eyes that assessed him with the same direct practical efficiency she applied to everything. She said, "You need something." It was not a question. He had the mare's reins in his hand and the mare behind him, and it was obvious what he needed. And she was not the kind of woman who asked questions she already knew the answers to. He said, 2 new shoes on the mare and a buckle fixed if you have time. She looked at the mare the way she had looked at him, quickly and completely, and then she said, "Leave her and come back in 2 hours." He said, "I can wait." She looked at him again with those direct green eyes, and something moved across her face that was not quite amusement, and not quite anything else he had a name for, and she said, "Suit yourself," and turned back to the anvil. He found a place to sit on the fence, and he waited, and he watched her work because there was nothing else to look at, and also because he found he did not particularly want to look at anything else. And by the time she was done with the mare's shoes, he had been sitting on that fence for an hour and 40 minutes and had not once thought about the letter in his jacket pocket, or the thing it said, or the decision he was going to have to make before the week was out. That was the first time Jack Puit understood he might be in some difficulty. He came back the next day with a reason that he knew was thin, and suspected she knew was thin, and she took the reason at face value without comment, and fixed what needed fixing. And he sat on the fence again and watched her work, and they talked a little, not much, practical things, and he went away again and thought about her for the rest of the day in a way that was inconvenient, given everything else he had to be thinking about. He came back the day after that with a reason that was thinner still. She was fitting a hinge on a gate leaning against the smithy wall when he came through the yard gate, and she looked up at him, and then at the completely sound and healthy horse he had brought with him, and then back at him, and she said, "What does that horse actually need?" He said, "I am not entirely sure." She looked at him for a moment, and then she did the thing that he had not yet seen her do. She smiled, not a polite small smile, but a real one, quick and bright and gone again almost immediately, and she said, "Well, tie her up and sit down then." He sat on the fence, and she went back to the hinge, and they talked in the easy, interrupted way of people, where one of them is working and the other is watching, the conversation stopping when the work required attention, and picking up again when it didn't. And it was the most comfortable hour he had spent in longer than he could clearly remember. He found out that she had grown up in the smithy, had been handing her father tools since she could walk, had learned the work the way children learn things when they are simply present for them long enough, gradually, and then completely. He found out that she had opinions about horses that were specific and well-founded, and that she expressed them without softening them for his benefit or anyone else's. He found out that she had read more than he would have guessed, and that she read the way she did everything, with her whole attention, and that she had thoughts about what she read that were interesting and sometimes contrary and always worth hearing. She found out that he had been riding for other men's outfits for 10 years, working cattle up and down the Panhandle and into New Mexico, that he was good at it and knew he was good at it without making a production of it. She found out that he was from Colorado originally, hill country, a ranch that had been in his family for 2 generations. She found out because she asked directly that there was no wife and never had been, and he answered directly because she was the kind of woman who asked direct questions and deserved direct answers. She said, "Why not?" He said, "I kept moving." She said, "And now?" He said, "And now I am sitting on a fence in Redbud, Texas, watching a woman shoe horses." She looked at him sideways and said, "That is not an answer." He said, "No, I suppose it is not." She went back to the hinge, and he watched her work, and the afternoon light moved across the smithy yard, and neither of them said anything more about it. But the question sat between them in the comfortable way of things that do not need to be resolved immediately to be understood. He stayed in Redbud. He found work at a ranch 3 miles out of town, temporary work, the kind that is called temporary and sometimes turns into something else, and he told himself it was convenient, and the pay was fair, and the outfit was decent, and all of these things were true and none of them were the reason. The evenings he came to the smithy and sat on the fence or on the porch step if the work was done, and the forge banked for the night, and they talked in the long way of people who are discovering that the other person's conversation is one of the things they most want in a day. He brought her coffee from the diner sometimes, and she accepted it without fuss, which he appreciated because some women made a thing of accepting small things, and Norah Callahan was not one of them. She put his hat on her head once when her hands were full and forgot it was there for half an hour, and he did not remind her because he liked it there, liked the image of it, her red braid hanging down and his hat sitting crooked above her eyes. She caught him looking and said, "What?" He said, "Nothing." She said, "You have a look on your face." He said, "What kind of look?" She considered him for a moment, and then she said, "The kind that is going to make things complicated," and she handed him the hat back and went inside to bank the forge, and he sat on the porch step and turned the hat in his hands and thought she was probably right about that. It was 3 weeks after he came to Redbud that she showed him what she did at night. He had come by after supper to return a book she had lent him, and found the forge still lit at an hour when it was usually dark, and the sound of the hammer going in a different rhythm than her working rhythm, slower and more careful. And he stood in the yard and listened for a moment, and then went to the smithy door and looked in. She had not heard him over the hammer and the forge, and she was working something small, bent over the anvil with a concentration that was different from her ordinary working concentration, more interior, more private. And he watched without announcing himself because something told him to wait, to just watch for a moment, and what he saw was this. She was making a flower, a rose, or something that intended to be a rose, the petals shaped one by one from thin iron, each one curved and textured with small, precise hammer strokes, and beside her on the workbench were others, a handful of them, iron flowers and what looked like a bird with its wings half open, and something else he could not quite make out from the doorway. And all of it was done with a delicacy and a care that was entirely different from the clean, practical work she did in the daylight hours. This was something else. This was the thing she could not do, and he understood that immediately and completely. He must have moved because she looked up, and for one unguarded moment before she put the composure back, he saw something he was not supposed to see, a vulnerability about being found doing this, a bracing for a particular kind of response. And he understood that too, understood that she had probably learned to keep this private because people did not always know what to do with the parts of a person that did not fit the shape they had decided that person was. He said, "Norah," she said, "I did not hear you come in," and started to put the flower down. He said, "Don't." She stopped and looked at him. He crossed the smithy and picked up the iron bird from the workbench, the one with its wings half open, and held it in his hands and looked at it for a long time, and she watched him look at it with the careful expression of someone waiting to find out what something costs. He said, "How long have you been doing this?" She said, "Since I was about 12. My father let me use the scraps." He said, "Does anyone know?" She said, "You do now." He looked at her across the workbench with the iron bird in his hands, and she looked back at him, and he thought, there it is. There is the thing underneath all the directness, and the hammer, and the green eyes that don't ask for anything. There is the thing she makes in the dark when no one is watching, and he felt something in his chest move in a way that was significant and slightly alarming and completely out of his control. He set the bird down carefully and said, "You should not keep these hidden." She said, "People come to me for horseshoes and hinges." He said, "People don't always know what they need until they see it." She looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her face, something small and careful, and she said, "That might be the most useful thing you have said in 3 weeks of coming around here." He laughed, a real laugh, and she looked at him with an expression he would think about later, the expression of someone watching something they find unexpectedly good. The letter had been in his jacket pocket for 4 weeks. He had read it the day it came, and then folded it and put it away and told himself he would deal with it, and had not dealt with it, because dealing with it meant making a decision he did not want to make. And he was still not dealing with it the night he sat on Norah's porch step with his coffee going cold in his hands, and she sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and the stars above Redbud were doing what Texas stars did in October, filling the whole sky from edge to edge until there was more light than dark up there. She said, "Something is on your mind." He said, "Something has been on my mind for 4 weeks." She said, "The letter." He turned and looked at her, and she was looking at the stars with a calm expression that told him she had noticed the letter some time ago and had been waiting for him to bring it up, which was exactly the kind of thing Norah Callahan would do. Notice everything and wait for you to come to it in your own time. He said, "My father is dying in Colorado. The ranch is falling apart, and my brothers cannot hold it together without more hands, and they are asking me to come home." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "And you have been sitting on that fence in my yard for 4 weeks instead of going?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the stars were enormous above them, and the night was cool and quiet around the smithy, and he thought about all the things he could say, and all the things that were true, and the distance between those two categories. He said, "You know why, Norah?" She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Yes, I do." Neither of them said anything for a while, and the night settled around them, and the forge ticked as it cooled, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and stopped. She said, "Go, Jack." He said her name. She said, "Your father is dying, and your family needs you, and you know what you have to do. Go." He said, "Norah, there are things I have not said." She said, "I know what you have not said. And I know what I have not said, and some things do not need to be said to be true." He looked at her profile in the starlight, the loose strands of her red hair, and the straight line of her jaw, and the way she was holding herself very still, in the particular way of someone who is feeling a great deal, and has decided to feel it quietly, and he thought about everything he wanted to say, and everything she had just told him she already knew, and he understood that she was right, that some things did not need to be said to be true, and that she was giving him something by saying go without making him choose, giving him the road without making him pay for it with something he could not get back. He said, "I will come back." She said, "Don't say that." He said, "I mean it." She turned and looked at him, and her green eyes were very steady, and she said, "Then don't say it. Mean it quietly and come back, or don't. But don't make me a promise tonight that has to carry all this weight." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded, and she nodded back, and they sat together on the porch step for another hour without saying much, and it was the best hour he could remember, and also the hardest. And when he finally stood up to go, she stood too, and they looked at each other in the dark, and he took her face in his hands and kissed her once, slow and certain, and she kissed him back without hesitation and without holding anything back. And when they stepped apart, she looked at him with those steady green eyes and said, "Go on then." He went. 6 months is long enough for a Texas winter to come and go and leave the hill country smelling like cedar and new grass. And Norah Callahan worked through all of it, up before dawn every morning, the forge going by first light, the horses and the hinges and the tools and the gates, all the practical necessary work of keeping a smithy and a reputation and a life running as it should. She thought about him with a regularity she did not try to manage, because she had found that trying to manage what you thought about was less effective than simply letting the thoughts come and go like weather. And the thoughts came and went, and she got up every morning and fired the forge and did the work. She made things at night. She made more things than she had before, the iron flowers and the birds and other things. A horse that was just barely a horse. More the idea of one, a running figure that suggested speed and intention, and she did not examine too carefully why she was making more of them than usual, or what she was working toward with the extra hours at the forge. The winter broke in late February, and March came in warm and smelling of rain and new things, and on a Tuesday morning in the first week of March, Norah Callahan came to the smithy at first light and found a wooden box on the porch step. She stood and looked at it for a moment, her coffee cup in both hands, the morning air cool and clean around her. And then she set her cup on the porch rail and crouched down and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in burlap, was an iron rose. Not her work. She knew her work, and this was not it. The technique was different, less refined, the petals thicker than she would have made them, the shaping done with less precision, but with something else that her work did not always have. A force and a directness, each hammer stroke deliberate and certain. The whole thing done by someone who was not a trained smith, making something beautiful, but by someone who was something else entirely, making something true. And the difference between those two things hit her somewhere below the sternum and took her breath. There was a piece of paper folded underneath it. She unfolded it with hands that were not entirely steady and read what was written there. 2 lines in a handwriting that was plain and unpracticed and completely legible. I meant it quietly. I am at the gate. She read it twice and then pressed the paper flat against her chest with both hands and closed her eyes and breathed the March morning air and felt everything she had been keeping quietly through the winter move through her all at once, the long months of it, and she let it move through her because that was the only thing to do with it. Then she opened her eyes. She stood up. She turned around. He was at the gate, his hat in his hand, his gray in the road behind him, leaner than he had been, and weathered in a new way that the winter had put on him. And he was looking at her the way he had looked at the iron bird in her smithy 6 months ago, like something he intended to take very good care of. She looked at him across the yard in the early March morning, and she felt the smile come up from somewhere she had not been able to reach for 6 months, wide and unguarded, and completely hers. And she walked across the yard toward the gate because there had been enough distance between them, and she was done with it. She opened the gate. She said, "You look terrible." He said, "It was a long winter." She said, "Yes, it was." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Norah, There are things I did not say. She said, I know, he said. I would like to say them now. She looked up at him in the morning light, the March air cool and clean around them, the smithy behind her, and the road and the hill country ahead of them, and all the time in front of them that had not yet been decided. And she said, well, come inside then. The forge is not going to light itself. He laughed, and she turned and walked back across the yard, and he came through the gate and followed her, and the morning opened up around them, gold and new, and the iron rose sat on the porch step in the early light and caught it.